A poor veteran found an abandoned ship, and the whole village laughed at him. No one believed that anything could be made out of this wreck, but what this ship turned into, thanks to his perseverance and his dog's loyalty, forever changed people's minds and shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. The road that led into the fishing village was little more than a thread of cracked asphalt running along the edge of the restless sea. Salt clung to everything. It hung in the air, seeped into the earth, and coated the windows of the handful of houses that leaned toward the shoreline as if seeking shelter from the gales. Ethan Cole drove slowly, his old pickup groaning with each mile, the German shepherd at his side pressing a wet nose against the glass. Ranger had always hated the scent of rust and brine, but he seemed to sense his master's determination and remained quiet, his ears alert. For Ethan, the journey was not just a return to the coast, but a reluctant return to the remnants of himself. The village revealed itself as a place that time had not so much forgotten as surrendered. Docks sagged under the weight of decades without repair, and boats lay capsized in the marsh grass, their hulls blackened with mold and salt. The men and women who remained here had the same look as the buildings and vessels, weather-worn, bowed, but stubbornly upright. They had endured the decline of the fisheries, the storms that chewed through roofs and seawalls, and the relentless emigration of younger generations to cities that offered promise the sea never kept. Ethan felt the landscape mirror his own decline. He had once been a man of stature, a soldier with shoulders squared and eyes sharp as steel. Years in uniform had left him scarred in ways the world could not see. And when he returned from his last deployment, the home he expected to find had crumbled. His wife left when the shop he had poured his savings into failed. His children, grown and wary of the man who could no longer speak without shadows trailing his words, drifted away. Now he carried only the silence of loss and the weight of memories. He drove past the last cluster of houses and toward the outskirts where the land gave way to marsh and stone. It was here, among reeds and abandoned nets, that he first saw the shape rising against the horizon. At first glance, it seemed like the skeleton of a whale, vast and immovable, its bones eaten through by time. But as the sun shifted, its true form emerged. A ship, a once proud coastal vessel, now stranded on blocks of wood and iron beams, driven deep into the earth. It stood as if someone long ago had tried to preserve it, but the effort had been abandoned. Rust cascaded down its sides in streaks, the paint peeled in great curls, and the windows stared hollow-eyed across the bay. Villagers had given it a name. Ethan learned this when two fishermen passed, their laughter carried on the wind. "The coffin on stilts," one muttered, spitting into the dirt. The other chuckled, shaking his head, saying it was cursed that anyone who tried to live in it would be swallowed whole by bad fortune. To them, it was a monument of failure, a reminder of storms that sank dreams and of livelihoods that could not be resurrected. But Ethan did not see a coffin. He saw himself. He parked the truck at the edge of the weeds and stepped out, his boots sinking into damp earth. Ranger bounded ahead, sniffing at the tangles of rope and shards of wood scattered at the vessel's base. The dog barked once, sharp and eager, as though declaring that this was worth investigating. Ethan tilted his head back to take in the full size of the ship. It towered above him, its bow jutting toward the sky with cracked majesty. For a moment he imagined it alive again, waves foaming against its hull, the creak of rigging and the call of gulls circling above. He laid a hand against the cold metal. Flakes of rust crumbled under his touch, staining his palm red-brown. A shiver passed through him that was not from the wind. In this ruin, he felt not despair but possibility. The ship was ruined, yes, but it was still standing. Like him, both relics of another time, unwanted yet not destroyed. The decision came without words. He would not sleep another night in the cab of his truck. This vessel would be his refuge. It did not matter if the villagers mocked him, if they whispered that he was mad. What mattered was that for the first time in years, he felt pulled towards something instead of merely drifting away. That night he returned, parking closer, ignoring the wary stares of a few villagers who passed with lanterns and baskets. He carried a small bag of belongings, the last remnants of a life scattered by circumstance. A blanket, a dented kettle, a worn photo of his children, and a knife his father had once given him. Ranger padded beside him, ears twitching at every creak of the abandoned hull. The entrance was half collapsed, but Ethan found a way through, pushing aside a broken plank that groaned in protest. Inside, the air was thick with mildew. Darkness swallowed the passageways, broken only by thin shafts of moonlight that slipped through shattered windows. He smelled salt-soaked wood and the faint memory of oil. The floor sagged in places, and he moved carefully, testing each step with the weight of a man who had marched too many miles through uncertain ground. Ranger pressed close to his leg, uneasy but loyal. The silence was profound. No voices, no traffic, not even the hum of a refrigerator. Only the sigh of the wind through holes in the walls and the faint lap of waves beyond the marsh. Ethan unrolled his blanket in what might once have been a crew's sleeping quarters. The space was cramped and filthy, but the metal walls gave him a strange sense of protection. He struck a match, lit a stub of candle, and the flickering light cast long shadows across the peeling paint. As he sat on the cold floor, the absurdity of his choice might have overwhelmed him on another night. But now he felt only a quiet resolution. Ranger curled against him, warm and breathing steadily, anchoring him in the moment. Ethan's gaze wandered up to the rusted ceiling, and for the first time in a long while, he did not dread the coming day. He closed his eyes and let the sounds of the wind and sea carry him into a restless but determined sleep. Tomorrow, he told himself without words, he would begin. The coffin on stilts would no longer be just a monument to failure. It would be his project, his purpose, his proof that even the broken could be made whole again. And so the man who had lost everything but his dog and his will to survive began his journey, not on the water, but on the shore, in the shadow of a ship that no one else believed in. From that night on, the fate of the veteran and the vessel became bound together. Two relics struggling not just to endure, but to live again. Morning came slowly, filtered through the cracked hull and jagged windows of the abandoned vessel. Ethan woke stiff and sore on the thin blanket, his breath forming a pale mist in the cold air. Ranger had slept pressed against him, the dog's warmth the only shield against the chill that seeped through the steel walls. For a moment as consciousness returned, Ethan wondered if he had only dreamed the previous night, if the decision to claim this wreck as his home had been some desperate fantasy. But the smell of rust and salt was real. The weight of the ship above him was real, and the strange stirring in his chest, a fragile ember of purpose, was very real. He rose to his feet, brushing flakes of paint from his jacket, and struck another match to light the stub of candle he had set on a metal crate. The weak glow illuminated the devastation around him. The floor was layered with debris, rotten boards, broken glass, tangled nets, and scraps of rusted machinery that had long ago surrendered to decay. The air was thick, stale with mildew, and in the far corner, water dripped steadily through a crack in the ceiling, pooling into a stagnant puddle. Ranger padded over to the puddle, sniffed, then sneezed loudly, shaking his head as if in disapproval. Ethan looked around and felt the weight of the task ahead pressing down on him. It would have been easy to give up before he had even begun. The ship was not merely damaged, it was ruined, a carcass left to rot by time and weather. The villagers were right to call it cursed, he thought. Yet in that curse he saw reflection. He too had been written off, declared useless by the world, a man beyond repair. If he could bring this place back to life, perhaps he could prove that nothing, neither man nor metal, was ever truly beyond redemption. He stepped outside into the gray morning, the air sharp with sea salt and the cries of gulls wheeling overhead. The marsh grass bent in the wind, and beyond it, the waves broke against the rocks with a rhythm that seemed both eternal and indifferent. From the bed of his pickup, he retrieved the few tools he owned: a crowbar, a shovel, a battered hammer, and a pair of work gloves stained with years of labor. Not much, but enough to begin. Back inside, he started clearing a path. He swung the crowbar into a rotted door that sagged across the passage, the wood splintering with a groan. He hauled away pieces of collapsed wall, stacked broken planks in a growing pile near the entrance, and pushed aside the remnants of rusted piping. Each movement was heavy and exhausting, but the sheer physicality of it was a balm to his restless mind. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the cold, and his muscles burned with the effort, but the labor quieted the noise that often surged unbidden in his head, the echoes of gunfire, the screams, the chaos of battles that refused to stay buried. Here in the wreck, every strike of the hammer was a blow against the darkness within. Ranger followed him through the corridors, weaving among debris, occasionally barking when he discovered some forgotten corner or hidden mound of rubble. At one point, the dog pawed at a nest of moldy rags, sending a family of startled rats scurrying into the shadows. Ethan grimaced, but instead of despair, he felt a grim determination harden inside him. If rats could survive here, so could he. By midday, the light filtering through the cracks had shifted, filling the interior with a pale glow. Ethan paused to drink from his canteen, sitting on a plank with his back against the cold metal wall. He looked at what he had accomplished so far. The floor was partially cleared, enough to see patches of the original steel beneath. The air smelled slightly fresher, less suffocating. It was almost imperceptible, but it was change, and change was hope. He worked until his hands throbbed and his knees felt unsteady. By late afternoon, he had carried bag after bag of debris outside, piling them into the bed of the truck until it overflowed. The villagers passed occasionally, their eyes lingering on him with a mixture of curiosity and scorn. Some shook their heads, whispering to one another, certain he had lost his mind. Ethan pretended not to notice, but he heard them clearly enough. "Madman," one muttered. "Better to tear it down than waste time," another said. The words cut, but he kept his face impassive. Let them laugh. He was no stranger to ridicule. He had endured worse on battlefields and in hospital wards. What mattered was not their judgment, but his own resolve. As the sun dipped lower, he returned inside for one last round of work. He ripped down a tangle of old curtains that disintegrated into dust at his touch, letting the remaining daylight spill into the cabin. He pried up sections of rotted flooring, exposing beams that, though weathered, were still strong beneath. He imagined what this place might become, a space not of decay but of shelter, a sanctuary carved from ruin. The labor left him aching, but when he finally stepped back outside, the ship already looked different. It was subtle. No one else might have noticed, but to his eyes the vessel was less of a tomb and more of a canvas. The piles of refuse at its base were evidence of progress, however small. That night he built a small fire in a barrel he had dragged from the marsh. The flames danced against the hull, casting the ship in a glow that made it seem alive again. He sat with Ranger beside him, feeding scraps of wood into the fire, staring at the shadows it threw across the rusted surface. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt exhaustion, not from despair, but from work accomplished. His body hurt, but his spirit, though fragile, stirred with something like pride. As darkness fell and the wind rose, Ethan unrolled his blanket once more inside the gutted cabin. He lay listening to the creak of the hull, the moan of the wind, and the steady breathing of his dog. The villagers might see only madness in his labor, but he felt the faintest glimmer of order in the chaos. The ship had begun to change, and so had he. Tomorrow would bring more struggle, more ridicule, more backbreaking work. But tonight, as he drifted into uneasy sleep, he carried with him the certainty that he had taken the first step on a long road. The cleansing had begun, not only of the ship but of himself, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to believe that the journey was worth it. The second night on the ship was colder than the first. The damp air crept through every crack in the hull, slipping across the floor and up Ethan's spine no matter how tightly he wrapped himself in the blanket. Ranger lay curled against him, the dog's body heat warding off the worst of the chill, but comfort was scarce in that steel tomb. Ethan drifted in and out of shallow sleep, his mind never fully surrendering to rest. Each time his eyes closed, the silence pressed too heavily, and the creak of the hull blended with memories that had stalked him for years. When sleep finally claimed him, it did so with claws. He dreamed of desert winds carrying the acrid stench of smoke and blood. He saw the faces of men he had led, some younger than his own children, their eyes wide in terror during the chaos of ambush. He heard the clatter of gunfire echoing off canyon walls, the shouts of orders drowned in explosions. The nightmare shifted without warning, and he was standing on this very ship, except the corridors were filled with shadows of soldiers calling his name. They bled into the walls, their cries merging with the moan of the storm outside. Ethan turned and turned, but could not find an exit. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was a prison of memory, and the ghost would not let him leave. He woke with a strangled gasp, his body slick with sweat despite the icy air. The candle had burned out, leaving him in darkness. For a moment he did not know where he was, desert battlefield or the cabin of the wreck. Then Ranger's head pressed firmly against his chest, a soft whine vibrating in the dark. Ethan reached down with a shaking hand and buried his fingers in the thick fur. The simple solidity of the dog's presence grounded him, tethered him back to the present. The ghosts receded, but they did not vanish. They never truly did. Morning light eventually pried through the broken windows, dull and gray, revealing the wreckage of the cabin around him. Ethan rose slowly, his muscles sore from the previous day's labor. He moved to the hull and pressed his palm against the cold steel, as though trying to absorb strength from the immovable mass. It struck him then how much this ship mirrored his own state. Hollowed, broken, declared useless by others, yet still enduring. The villagers called it cursed, and perhaps they were right. But if a cursed vessel could stand for decades against wind and salt, perhaps a cursed man could stand as well. He set himself again to work. The cleansing had only begun, and there was still more rot to tear out. He hauled away warped planks that cracked like brittle bones when pried loose. He knocked down collapsed partitions, their splinters raining across the floor. Each strike of the hammer reverberated in his chest, echoing like the report of distant rifles. But instead of panic, it brought a strange steadiness. Here, every blow was his choice, not chaos forced upon him. The day stretched into a rhythm of sweat and strain. Ranger prowled beside him, alert for vermin, barking when a rat darted from beneath a heap of rope. Ethan grunted at the interruption, but secretly felt grateful for the company. The ship was a cavern of echoes, and without the dog's presence, it might have driven him mad. By afternoon, his hands were blistered beneath the gloves, his shoulders raw with fatigue. He collapsed onto an overturned crate and pulled a canteen from his pack. As he drank, his gaze fell on something half buried in the grime near the far wall. He pushed himself up and approached, curiosity piercing the fog of exhaustion. It was a rectangular plate of corroded brass, bolted crookedly to the wall, its surface so tarnished the letters were almost invisible. He rubbed at it with his sleeve until faint words emerged, the name of the ship. The letters were faded, but they carried the dignity of something once proud. He whispered them under his breath, tasting the weight of them. For the first time, the ship was no longer an anonymous carcass. It had an identity, a history, however forgotten. He traced the letters with his finger, and something within him stirred an acknowledgement that both he and the ship were more than failures. They were survivors with stories yet unfinished. As dusk drew near, he carried another armload of debris outside and paused to study the vessel from the ground. It still looked battered, its hull streaked with rust, its windows gaping like empty eyes. But where he had torn out rot, there was now space. Where once was suffocating filth, there was now air. It was still a ruin, but it was a ruin with the faintest whisper of possibility. That night he tried to sleep again within the gutted cabin, but the dreams returned. This time they were less chaotic, but more insidious. He saw his wife's face, pale with disappointment, heard the sound of his son's voice hardened with resentment. He saw the woodworking shop he had built with his own hands, shuttered and lifeless, its windows boarded. And always beneath it all, the cries of the battlefield, the accusation of voices that no longer lived. He thrashed against the blanket, his breath ragged, until Ranger barked sharply, startling him awake. In the stillness afterward, Ethan sat with his back against the wall, stroking the dog's head. He stared into the shadows, knowing the ghost would never leave him entirely. Yet as he listened to the wind whistle through the cracks of the hull, he realized he was no longer running from them. For the first time, he was facing them in a place where their presence could not destroy him. The ship might creak and groan like the voices of the dead, but it also stood, rooted to the earth, unbroken by storm. He clung to that thought like a lifeline. Days passed in this rhythm, labor by daylight, battles with memory by night. Each morning he rose with his body aching, his hands raw, his muscles tighter, but each day the ship looked a little less like a corpse and a little more like a frame awaiting rebirth. Each night he endured the visions, the weight of his failures pressing hard, yet always softened by the steady loyalty of the dog at his side. Ranger seemed to understand in a way no human ever could, his amber eyes holding a patience that asked no questions and passed no judgment. One evening, as the last of the sun painted the horizon in bruised purples and gold, Ethan stood on the deck and let the wind lash against his face. The sea roared beyond the marsh, eternal and merciless. The villagers still muttered when they passed, still called the vessel cursed. But to him it was no longer a coffin on stilts. It was a crucible, burning away the decay not only of rust and rot, but of the man who had once believed himself already dead inside. The ghosts would remain, he knew. They were carved into his mind as surely as the salt was etched into the steel of the hull. But as he looked at the cleared passageways and the emerging skeleton of what might one day become a home, he felt a shift. The ghosts no longer dictated his every breath. They were present, yes, but he was standing despite them. Just as the ship stood despite its scars, and for the first time in many years, Ethan allowed himself the fragile hope that he might yet be able to build something lasting, not only from the wreckage of this vessel, but from the wreckage of himself. The days bled into one another, the rhythm of labor shaping the flow of Ethan's time. He no longer measured his existence by calendars or clocks, but by the progress made within the rusted hull of the ship. Morning came with the pale glow filtering through the jagged holes in the vessel's body, and evening fell with the call of gulls wheeling against the darkening sky. Each day he rose stiff and sore, yet with a clarity of purpose he had not felt in years. The ship was changing beneath his hands, slowly, stubbornly, but changing nonetheless. And with every board he pulled, every nail he hammered, he felt his own burdens shift in ways he could not yet name. Inside the hull, where once shadows had clung thick and mildew had suffocated the air, there was now space and breath. The refuse piles he had dragged outside grew into small mountains at the vessel's base, a testament to the sheer persistence of his work. He had pried away the rotted timbers, stripped out corroded fittings, and now beams long hidden beneath decay revealed their strength. Some had suffered, yes, but many still held firm, iron and oak bones refusing to surrender despite decades of neglect. Ethan studied them with the eye of a craftsman, the instinct that had once guided him in his woodworking shop stirring again. They could be saved, and if they could be saved, then perhaps so could the man rebuilding them. He began the slow process of fitting new boards along the flooring, salvaging what materials he could from the piles of debris scattered around the shipyard, and bartering with villagers when possible. They eyed him warily, amused or skeptical, but his persistence earned him grudging respect. When he asked for discarded planks or rusted nails, some shrugged and let him take what he wanted. Others offered the scraps at low cost, muttering that he was throwing his strength into a doomed cause. Ethan took it all, piling the wood in neat stacks beside the hull, refusing to answer their doubts with words. His answer would be in the transformation itself. The first time he laid a new plank across the cabin floor and nailed it in place, the sound echoed sharp and true through the hollowed corridors. It rang differently than the groans of rust and decay. It was solid, alive, a heartbeat reverberating within the carcass of the vessel. Ethan paused, letting the vibration travel through the soles of his boots, and felt something awaken within him. He remembered standing in his workshop years ago, guiding his hands across fresh timber, the grain unfolding beneath his touch, the clean scent of sawdust filling the air. That world had collapsed under the weight of debt and despair, but here in the shell of this forgotten ship, he rediscovered a piece of himself he thought had been lost forever. Ranger watched every movement as though understanding its significance. The dog lay near the entrance of the cabin, his amber eyes following Ethan's progress, occasionally rising to inspect the newly fitted wood with a sniff and a satisfied huff before settling down again. In the evenings when Ethan lit the small barrel fire outside and sat with sore muscles, Ranger curled beside him, head resting on his master's leg, eyes half closed in contentment. In that companionship, Ethan found not just comfort, but affirmation. They were building this together, man and dog, two survivors reshaping ruin into refuge. It was during one such evening, as the firelight flickered against the steel hull, that Ethan noticed the villagers passing with different eyes. Some still shook their heads, dismissing his labor as madness, but others slowed their steps. A fisherman paused with his net slung over one shoulder, staring at the faint glow seeping from the newly cleared windows. A woman carrying a basket of shellfish lingered long enough to watch Ethan hammer another plank into place before hurrying on. Their silence spoke more than their words had before. He was no longer an invisible exile. They might still see him as broken, but they could not deny his determination. Inside, the transformation deepened. Ethan stripped what remained of the mildew-soaked partitions and began fashioning new frames. He carved simple but sturdy beams, sanded them until they were smooth beneath his palms, and fitted them with the care of a man who understood that strength lay not just in the materials, but in the patience of the maker. The smell of fresh wood began to overwhelm the lingering stench of rot, filling the air with a scent that stirred memory and hope alike. He could almost pretend he was back in his workshop, except this time, the weight of expectation and commerce did not suffocate him. This time, each cut, each joint, each polished surface was for himself, for Ranger, for the possibility of a home that could not be foreclosed or repossessed. The day he finished the small bench and table for the cabin, Ethan sat down upon them and felt a quiet pride course through him. The furniture was simple, rough in places, but it was born from his own hands and from wood that only days before had lain forgotten in mud and rot. Ranger climbed onto the bench beside him, tail thumping lightly, and Ethan chuckled softly, running his hand through the dog's thick coat. In that moment, the cabin was no longer a tomb. It was a place of life, however modest. As autumn deepened, the air grew sharper, carrying the first whispers of winter storms. Ethan worked faster, knowing the season ahead would test both him and the ship. He sealed cracks with tar and rags, patched holes in the hull, and fitted scraps of glass into the broken windows. The light that poured in during the day was clearer now, casting warm beams across the pine boards he had sanded smooth. At night, when the wind howled through the marshes, the ship no longer moaned with emptiness, but held steady, as though recognizing its own rebirth. The villagers began to murmur less scorn and more curiosity. Children dared each other to approach, peeking through the gaps to watch Ethan plane a board or drive nails with practiced rhythm. Some of the older men, themselves craftsmen in their youth, stopped to offer a word of advice or a handful of nails long forgotten in sheds. Ethan accepted each gesture with a nod, his words few but his gratitude evident in the way he put every gift to use. The coffin on stilts, as they had called it, was becoming something else before their eyes, though none dared admit it aloud. On the night he finished building the crude but sturdy hearth in one of the cabins, Ethan lit a fire inside. The smoke curled upward through a pipe he had fashioned, and the flames threw golden light across the pine boards. He sat beside the fire, Ranger stretched on the rug of burlap sacks, and listened to the crackle echo against the steel walls. The warmth seeped into his bones, chasing away the damp chill that had haunted him since the first night. For the first time in years, he felt not like a man sheltering from the world, but like a man inhabiting a home. He leaned back, staring at the flicker of firelight dancing across the brass plate with the ship's name still bolted to the wall. The letters gleamed faintly, as though watching him. He thought of the lives this vessel might have carried, the journeys across seas now forgotten. And he thought of his own journey, not yet over, perhaps only beginning anew. This ship would never sail again, he knew. Its time on the water had ended. But on land, rooted in the soil of this windswept village, it could become something else entirely. It could become sanctuary, and so could he. When he finally drifted into sleep that night, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and the steady breath of his dog, the ghosts of his past still lingered, but their voices seemed quieter. Where once they had drowned him in regret, now they whispered only faintly against the stronger sound of hammer and saw, of progress and persistence. For the first time in a long time, Ethan dreamed not of battles lost, but of walls rising, floors firm beneath his feet, and windows glowing with light. And so, in the heart of a village that had dismissed him, in the shell of a ship long condemned as cursed, the first signs of change had taken root. Neither the man nor the vessel was whole yet, but both had begun to remember what it meant to endure, and more than endure, to live. The first storm of winter announced itself with a restless wind that swept across the marshes and rattled through the narrow lanes of the village. Ethan had been expecting it for days, watching the sky darken and the gulls wheel low over the water, as though warning of what was to come. He stood on the deck of the ship, his hands resting on the railing he had reinforced with salvaged beams, and let the wind sting his face. Ranger sat at his feet, ears flat, eyes scanning the horizon. Both man and dog felt the shift in the air, the tightening of the season that would test every nail driven, every seam patched. Every moment of labor poured into the vessel's resurrection. When the storm finally broke, it did so with violence. Rain lashed against the hull in sheets, each drop striking like a drumbeat. The sea roared in the distance, its fury carried inland, and the marsh grass bent low, nearly flattened by the gusts. Ethan retreated inside, sealing the patched windows with cloth and boards, listening as the wind howled around the ship. The vessel groaned and shuddered, but it held. Where once it would have rattled with emptiness, its walls now resisted, strengthened by his months of work. Each creak was a reminder of its scars, yet each refusal to yield was proof of its endurance. Inside, the hearth glowed, its flames licking at the iron pipe Ethan had rigged as a chimney. Heat radiated across the cabin, banishing the damp chill that had once seemed permanent. Ranger stretched out on the rug of stitched burlap sacks, his body a picture of calm even as the storm raged outside. Ethan sat at the table he had built, a simple plank across sturdy legs, and let the warmth soak into his bones. He had known nights of cold so biting it had felt like punishment, nights in the desert where the air froze without warning, nights in half-empty rooms where loneliness gnawed harder than frost. Tonight was different. Tonight, though the world outside battered and clawed, he sat in a place that answered with fire and strength. The storm lasted through the night, and in the early hours before dawn, Ethan rose, unable to sleep for the pounding of rain and the memories it summoned. He paced the narrow cabin, candlelight throwing tall shadows across the walls, the brass plate with the ship's name catching a faint gleam as if watching him. He thought of battles fought in places far from here, of how fragile the line between survival and collapse had always been. He had seen strong men fall to chaos, structures crumble with one strike too many. Yet this vessel, broken and abandoned for decades, stood through the fury of the sea as if refusing to surrender. He pressed a hand against the nearest beam, feeling its solidity, and whispered a silent vow that he too would stand, no matter the storm within or without. By morning the rain eased, and pale light seeped through the patched windows. The village bore scars of the night roofs torn, fences splintered, nets lost to the sea. Ethan stepped outside to survey the damage, water dripping from every edge of the ship, mud sucking at his boots. To his surprise, several villagers were gathered nearby, their expressions a mixture of fatigue and disbelief. They looked at the ship, expecting collapse, but it stood unbowed. One man muttered something about miracles. Another simply shook his head and walked away. Their scorn had softened into a wary respect, though none yet dared voice it aloud. As winter deepened, storms came often, less violent than the first but relentless. Each one tested the repairs, each one probed for weakness. Ethan answered with vigilance, patching leaks as they appeared, reinforcing beams, checking the seals along the windows. He grew accustomed to the rhythm of rain on steel, to the hiss of wind through the marsh, to the crackle of fire that defied it all. Nights that once might have swallowed him in despair now passed with a steady routine, tending the hearth, mending tools, carving scraps of wood into small shapes that rested on the table. Ranger was always near, sometimes lifting his head at a particularly fierce gust, sometimes sleeping through the noise as though certain nothing could harm them here. The villagers began to visit, quietly, cautiously. At first it was a boy who came knocking one evening, his face pale from the cold, asking if he might warm himself by the fire. Ethan opened the door without hesitation, and soon the boy sat with Ranger's head in his lap, smiling shyly as the dog accepted him. Another night, an old fisherman stopped by after his own roof gave way under the weight of snow. He sat at the table, his hands trembling from cold, and drank from a cup Ethan offered. Word spread slowly that the cursed ship was warm, that its walls no longer leaked, that its hearth burned steady. Where once laughter had followed Ethan through the village, now footsteps approached his door in quiet gratitude. The ship became more than refuge for one man and his dog. It became a shelter for those in need, a beacon of heat and light in a season that sought to extinguish both. Ethan did not seek thanks, nor did he offer speeches. He simply opened the door, stoked the fire, and shared what little he had. Each time someone entered, he felt the vessel grow stronger, not in wood or steel, but in spirit. The ship was no longer a coffin on stilts. It was a fortress against despair, for him and for the village that had once scorned him. Yet even in these moments of quiet triumph, the ghost remained. At night, when the visitors had gone, and only Ranger's steady breathing filled the cabin, Ethan still saw the faces of the past. He still woke in sweat, heart racing from dreams of fire and screams. But the difference was this: he no longer faced the nightmares alone in silence. He had the crackle of fire beside him, the weight of Ranger's head against his leg, and the knowledge that when morning came, the ship would still stand. The storms had not broken it, and they had not broken him. Winter dragged on, long and merciless. But within the steel walls and pine beams, life endured. Ethan rose each day with purpose, mended what needed mending, and greeted whoever knocked at his door. Slowly he began to believe that survival was not merely clinging to existence, but building something within it, even in the heart of ruin. The trial of winter was far from over, but each storm weathered bound him more tightly to the vessel he had claimed, and to the man he was becoming in its shadow. By the time the first hint of spring touched the marshes, the villagers no longer called it cursed. Some still whispered the old name, but with less conviction, as though embarrassed by their own doubt. More often they spoke of it with respect, a landmark that had stood through the worst the sea could throw. And Ethan, standing on the deck one evening with Ranger at his side, watching the sun dip into the water, felt a quiet pride swell in his chest. The ship had faced its trial, and so had he. Together they had endured. When the snows finally began to retreat from the fields around the village, and the marsh grass stirred once more, beneath the cautious warmth of the sun, the ship looked different than it had before the long winter. The streaks of rust were still there. The scars of its long abandonment had not vanished, but they no longer defined it. The vessel stood proud against the horizon, its patched windows glinting with light, its seams tight against the wind, its interior alive with the scent of pine and the memory of fire. The villagers who once mocked it as a coffin now looked upon it with quiet astonishment. They could not deny that it had endured, and in enduring it had transformed. Ethan rose early each day, the discipline of soldiering still guiding his movements, though softened now by a different kind of purpose. He fed Ranger, checked the beams, stoked the hearth, and then walked the deck, listening not just to the creaks of steel, but to the steady silence that told him all was sound. The storms of winter had tested the vessel mercilessly, but the walls still held. More importantly, they now held stories of villagers who had come seeking shelter, of children who had sat wide-eyed by the fire while snow battered the windows, of fishermen who had shared tales of storms past while drying their boots by the hearth. The ship had become more than Ethan's refuge. It had become part of the community, however quietly, and through it he had found a place among them again. The respect was never announced, never celebrated with speeches or handshakes. It revealed itself in subtler ways. A fisherman left a bundle of rope by the door without a word. A woman from the market placed a basket of apples on the step one morning, vanishing before Ethan could thank her. Children no longer dared each other to approach in mockery, but instead came running to greet Ranger, who basked in their attention with a wag of his tail. When Ethan passed through the village to gather supplies, the laughter that once followed him was gone. Men nodded, women smiled, And though no one spoke of the change aloud, he felt it in their eyes. Inside, the cabin bore little resemblance to the ruin he had first entered months before. The pine boards glowed in the sunlight, polished smooth by his hands. The bench and table stood sturdy, each scratch and groove a mark of honest labor. The hearth remained the heart of the space, its smoke curling upward into the sky like a signal of life reclaimed. The brass plate with the ship's name still hung on the wall, burnished now, a reminder that the vessel's story had not ended when the sea released it. It had only shifted, becoming something new, as he himself had done. Ethan often sat at the table in the evenings, knife in hand, shaping wood into small tokens. It had begun as a way to steady his mind, the act of carving pulling him away from darker thoughts. But as the months passed, he realized that each piece carried a meaning deeper than the craft itself. A bird with wings spread wide, a symbol of freedom long delayed but not denied. A fox curled in sleep, a reminder of rest earned after toil. A strong oak leaf, resilient and rooted even in storm. He set them on the shelf above the hearth, not as decoration but as quiet markers of a journey measured not in distance but in endurance. Ranger was always near, the silent witness to every moment of change. The dog had claimed his corner by the hearth, where the warmth seeped into his coat and the light flickered across his amber eyes. He watched Ethan with the loyalty of a companion who asked for nothing but gave everything. At night, when ghosts still prowled the edges of sleep, Ranger's steady breathing kept them at bay. By day, his bark warned away intruders or startled gulls that dared perch too close. He was guardian not only of the ship, but of the fragile peace that had taken root within it. As spring deepened, Ethan felt a shift within himself as profound as that which had overtaken the vessel. He no longer walked with the stoop of a man crushed by failure. His step was firm, his shoulders square, his gaze steady. The memories of war and loss still haunted him, but they no longer dictated every breath. He had faced them within these steel walls and found that he could live despite them. The woodworking shop, the debts, the broken family, those scars would never fully fade, but they no longer defined him. What defined him now was the home he had built from ruin, the life he had carved from decay. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the marshes gold, Ethan stood on the deck with Ranger at his side. The village lay behind them, its chimneys sending thin trails of smoke into the sky. Before them stretched the endless horizon, the sea glimmering with the promise of journeys never taken. Once, long ago, this ship had sailed those waters, had carried men across tides and storms. That chapter of its life had ended. But here, rooted on the shore, it had found another purpose. It had become a home, not a ship, and in that transformation it had given Ethan the chance to become more than a man surviving the wreckage of his past. He thought of the winters still to come, of the storms that would batter the hull, of the days of labor that still lay ahead. He did not fear them. He welcomed them, for each trial would only strengthen what he had built. The villagers would still whisper their stories, still weigh him with cautious eyes, but he had ceased to need their approval. His proof lay all around him, in the walls that no longer leaked, in the fire that no longer failed, in the dog that no longer shivered in the cold. His proof lay in the simple truth that the ship stood, and so did he. When darkness fell, Ethan descended into the cabin, stoked the fire, and settled into the chair he had built with his own hands. Ranger curled at his feet, the glow of the hearth painting both man and dog in warm light. Outside, the sea whispered against the shore, eternal and unyielding. Inside, within steel and pine, a soldier who had lost everything sat not as a man adrift, but as a man anchored. The ship was no longer a coffin on stilts. It was no longer cursed, it was home. And in that home, Ethan found not only shelter, but meaning, not only survival, but life, not only endurance, but hope. The vessel would never again sail the waters of the world, but it carried him nonetheless, carried him toward a future built not from fear or failure, but from the strength of standing, scarred yet unbroken in the face of every storm. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Hit subscribe now so you never miss our next powerful tale. Tap the bell so you're the first to watch when new stories drop. Want more right away? Click on the next video waiting for you on the screen. It's even more unbelievable. And don't keep this story to yourself. Share it with your friends and family because some stories are too good not to spread.